Going on, everybody? Kevin Cole here. Unexpected Points. Week in review pod, I'm calling it right now. The agenda for the day, and let me tell you, it's getting a little barren out in the NFL news streets. The agenda will be take questions from the paid subscribers on a post that I put out on the Substack, unexpectedpoints.substack.com for those who aren't hip to it. So we'll go over some of those questions, do some research on those. Put that a little bit after the first segment where I'm going to look at some articles that I thought were of interest that came out this week and dig into some points that came across that I wouldn't have necessarily expected that were pretty good, and maybe some overemphasized insights or causal relationships as part of these articles from the week. But like I said, there's not a lot going on article news wise. General discussion on signal versus noise, and then of course any questions that come through on the YouTube live stream, I will do so. For those who are listening via podcast format, which are most of the people here. I mean, I'm building up the YouTube a little bit here, but the podcast was around a lot longer, a lot more people on that. It's kind of the way that I prefer to consume most things. Maybe it's a function of not having the ability with ADHD to like sit and watch something unless I'm multitasking at the same time. I'd be interested to hear, though, from people who are listening via podcast when I'm going through some things like articles or visuals, which I attempt to describe in sufficient detail to make it possible to follow along with just in audio format. But I'd be interested to see, hey, how's that? Is anyone being lost there? Because I know my thoughts can become somewhat muddled, probably even for those who are paying attention via YouTube. So let me know what you think about that. But again, I prefer the audio format. So hopefully when it's coming through and most of the people are getting this via podcast, they're getting a lot that's going on through that method. All right, let's talk about what's going on in the NFL right now. And just as an illustration for the difficulty that we're going on right here, I'm going to bring up the Athletics homepage for the NFL and to just look at some of the top stories here that are going on in the NFL. There's a piece from Mike Sando here. I love Mike Sando. Sando NFL, I believe, is his Twitter handle. Everyone should follow him there. He has the move from each NFL team's offseason that I like the most. I think Barnwell has a somewhat analogous post where he's going through each team and he has like a superlative for each team over at ESPN. He has a superlative for each team and going through there again. You know, you're trying to generate that content this time of year. Interesting. Well, maybe his opinion there. 2024 NFL draft sleepers who could make an instant impact as rookies. I don't know. Is there? I'm guessing the signal to noise ratio is pretty high towards the latter on that one, or pretty low ratio, I guess, if I want to discuss it in ratios. Dak Prescott isn't concerned about his contract situation. I don't play for money. Well, that's good. I just don't pay him then. All right. Well, solved. Contract solved. Pro bono work from Dak Prescott coming in going forward. Dak Prescott's got a sweet contract situation. Not only has he been franchise tagged before, so it makes it more difficult to do so in the future, but the way they run things over there and with the dead money and the guarantees and everything else on those contracts and not having another option to turn to, he's going to get paid. Trust me. He's going to be playing for a lot of money, whether he wants to or not. A good one here. Now, this has to be one of my favorites. A thinner, motivated Lamar Jackson knows the Ravens must learn to finish. Really wrapping it all into one thing here. I guess Lamar Jackson has now lost weight after having gained weight in the past. Gained weight 2 years ago, and then he got injured at the end of the season 2 years ago. Then he was down some weight. a year ago, and now he's down even more weight, and he's the most elusive he's ever been. Of course, this is, best shape of my life season storylines, which are probably going to be the number one thing right now. A lot of embracing going on this time of year. I've seen Bryce Young embracing the new Panthers offense. What other one I see? Malik Neighbors embracing his role as the new number one wide receiver for the Giants. Yeah, all that stuff. We can ignore all that stuff. I will say for best shape of my life season, I prefer losing weight to gaining weight. I mean, these guys are pretty mature athletes, even when it looks like they're going into college, let alone getting out of college. So if they're gaining too much weight, I get a little suspicious of that. So losing weight, maybe there's something to that. Raiders GM Tom Telesco hoping balanced approach yields success. Again, that's just a nothing burger there. 18-game season. I'm sure we'll all talk about that. Harrison Butker stories. Oh, the Butker. Yeah, the Butker stories. Here's one thing. Okay, let me talk Butker for a second. Against my my better intuition, which says don't talk Butker at all here. This story, more than anything, falls right into the one of the things that I got from Bomani Jones. We was talking about Twitter, and I think this goes on to a larger degree in life when we're trying to figure things out. Is, are you trying to perform, or are you trying to inform? I think Butker was doing a little too much performing as opposed to informing in his speech, and then you best believe the responses are doing a lot of performing as opposed to informing. Now, I guess I would also divide that, and I think this could be good. This could be relevant to any subject matter that we're looking at. Are you trying to persuade, or are you trying to coerce without persuasion? Maybe I don't want to get into that too much, but I think I mentioned on a previous podcast, I've been doing some philosophizing, some political philosophy reading, some Plato. There's some good stuff in there about persuasion and the limits thereof persuasion. So I would also say responses to Butker have been more of the coercion type of responses as opposed to the persuasion responses. And again, this really does play a little bit into, maybe I'm making this a stretch here, but a little bit into kind of how I like to do things, maybe how I think the best way of doing analysis is if we're not going to be able to coerce people because we don't really have power as nerds in the NFL, despite what Mike Florio might say about the fact that the nerds are all, having private lunches with ownership and being wined and dined, and we're taking over the NFL, despite the fact that they're given jobs and their research is mostly put into the circular file by coaches and higher ups throughout the NFL. So more of the persuasion has to happen. So the persuasion can happen through, inflammatory type of stuff, if you want to say it, but more so, I think you have to persuade by, kind of steel manning the argument, maybe taking the best of what the argument may be on the other side, and then dissecting it and showing why it's not quite as good as it was. In this example, for even people who are against Butker here, and I'm not for necessarily anything that he was saying. I just thought that it was interesting that we've definitely seen more of the coercion versus persuasion. I haven't seen too much that has said, okay, let's look at what he's saying from an angle where we're maybe, good faith interpretation or this or that. Instead, and I think this is kind of why in a lot of areas we don't get anywhere. Instead, for instance, like you pull up this article here about Mahomes and Butker, a good person. There's all this stuff in here, blah, blah. I think there's an interesting, for instance, there's a sentence here. It says, he also addressed gender ideologies, whatever. Not whatever, but, we'll not get into that. Because the biggest thing has been all the stuff that he said about his wife. And he says, and said a woman's most important title is a homemaker, right? That's what it says here. Literally says here, most important title is a homemaker. If you look at the literal words of his speech, now they could be interpreted as saying this, but the literal word said one of the most important titles is a homemaker. So again, let's steel man. If you want to knock down Harrison Butker, let's steel man him there. So anyway, so not much going on there, but I did find some articles that I thought were somewhat interesting from this week. And again, when we look at them, we want to dissect them. We want to steel man the arguments we may not agree with, and we want to dig into them, even if they are stuff that we happen to agree with. So the first one I want to start with is being an interesting article that we can talk about, dealing with what's going on in the NFL, is scoring being on the decline. This is an article from Opta Analyst, and the title of the article is Explosive Defense. Why is the NFL scoring on the decline? Few different authors here, a handful here, guys doing visualizations, guys writing here. And I thought it was interesting because it's something that I've thought about a lot. It has some conclusions in this article, which I think add to what I've been thinking, some of them that I would dispute a little bit, but it's an interesting article to go through and think about because having background, trying to get to kind of like a ground truth in a type of situation of how things are, I think can be a good jumping off point to figuring out what we may be able to do in the future. I talked somewhat about Mike McDonald and some of the adjustments that he had made to defenses last year. And I think it's interesting, but I also think we get a little bit too caught maybe in prisoner of the moment and thinking there are large macro changes, which could be part of the noise, the signal noise, as we talked about, for the ratio there also being here. If we skip down to what they're talking about in this sort of article, it says the NFL's history is one of offenses and defenses trading punches, with the league office sometimes putting its thumb on the scale, and scoring has ebbed and flowed since the AFL-NFL merger in 1970. Pretty much true. If you look at some of the numbers, at least going back to 2000, there's a lot of up or down. They give some examples here of maybe illegal contact being brought in, now the hip drop tackles making a difference, and I'm sure that they have here. And the big focus, though, when they're looking at this, is everything is in a comparison for 2020, the pandemic season, and there is a lot of stuff here about the pandemic season. I think that's a very interesting thing that we need to focus in on, versus what we've just seen the last two seasons. And they have a graph on here for just NFL scoring averages per game. So it was up to 49.6 points per game in the NFL in 2020. And then that has declined now to underneath 44. And if you look at it, 2017, which was also a blip downwards. So 2017 was a slightly lower than this. We haven't seen anything this low since 2017. If we go back even further, the amount wouldn't have been lower since 2009. If you look past 2017. So a lot of years. So we're talking about a big decline. Now, I think there is somewhat of an upward trend here generally, like it's within the bounds, I think, for the decline that we've seen, that we could still say with the upward trend. I mean, for instance, again, we saw this decline in 2017 and then it jumped up to newer and higher heights. I also think maybe the starting point when we do declarative analyses on scoring being down, starting from the 2020 season and the pandemic season, is probably a mistake, because if there ever was such a thing as an outlier, we would say that season is somewhat of an outlier. Empty stadiums being played, the rejiggering of everything that's going on in society, a lot of free time probably on players and coaches' hands to do more. Well, coaches don't have any lives, let's face it, but more time definitely on players' hands to be doing preparation. Talking about best shape of my life season, they got kind of like nothing else better to do, and not going out as much and doing things like that. Actually restricted from going out according to the NFLPA rules, which probably helped bring some scoring about there. But I think generally scoring there's definitely something to the scoring being down. What's interesting is when there have been some mainstream discussions on this topic, they go off the rails so quickly because of the strong kind of instinctual biases that we've seen. People may not remember, who were listening to this or weren't listening to my podcast back then in the live streams. I did a YouTube live stream going back, I don't know when it was. I guess it may have been during the end of the season in 2022. So like, again, the decline is really from 2020 to 2021, there was a decline, which pretty much erased all gains from the previous year. Then it declined again in 2022, and only a slight decline from 2022 to 2023. So that 2022, almost all of the decline was there. And what was really interesting about this discussion, it was on NFL Live, and it was Orlovsky was talking, Mark Spears, trying to think of who else was there. Ryan Clark, Mina was part of the discussion, but she really wasn't part of she had some like stats that she threw in. She wasn't really part of the main discussion. But what was interesting about this discussion, and I think this is also something we gotta think about on how people like interpret this, is that it started off saying scoring is way down. So then it said yards per completion is way down, which was a weird thing to even show. Like yards per completion have been going down steadily for the last 25 years, because completion percentages are going up, yards per completion going down, but then yards per attempt have been going up. And if anything, a yards per attempt at a higher the same yards per attempt at a higher completion rate is actually a good thing for an offense. It keeps you more steady going down the field. So that was a weird stat that they were trying to throw in there to make it seem inflammatory, I guess, in some sort of way, but it was strange. But then they showed how yards per attempt for rushing was up slightly, like a tenth of a yard or something like that year over year, versus the scoring having declined significantly year over year. And then very quickly, so this is basically like the broad thematic thing was offenses are getting crushed, defenses are massively winning. Yet the discussion went off the rails very quickly, and most of the time was spent with the three former NFL players lamenting how soft defenses are for allowing more rushing, and how they've like taken all the linebackers out and they don't have enough people in the box. It's like, guys, the point of the discussion was that defenses are winning, right? Defenses are doing a good thing. Yet the focus of the last 3 quarters of the discussion, after all the numbers were placed out there showing that defenses are winning, we're talking about how defenses need to go back to what they were doing before. It was a totally nonsensical sort of thing. But again, this is what at least some teams are going to be running upstream against. More and more over time, I think the results are starting to come out now, and people have started to accept, hey, let's limit explosive plays. Let's put more defensive backs in there. Let's allow teams to rush a little bit more, and we're going to get better results in the NFL. But just like that's, of course, media is always way far behind the NFL, but at least that window through the media shows you how you still got to get over that like reflective instinct to say, this 0.1 yard per carry is a bigger thing than the fact that defenses are winning overall. It was strange. But anyway, so the scoring average is down quite a bit. So what can explain this? And it would even be down even if we're looking beyond 2020. But I think 2020 is a little bit of an outlier when we're thinking about it. And there's some different things that are going on here. One aspect that they talk about in this article that I think is important, and I think I missed it, so let me talk about it here. Okay, one quote in here which I think needs to be talked about here. It says, almost anyone would tell you the league currently enjoys a boom of quarterback and receiver talent, with some of the best offensive players ever dropping jaws in NFL stadiums, particularly the AFC. Now, I would disagree with that. Not that Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Burrow, who they mention here, are not really good quarterbacks, but I would say overall, if we're looking at a longer arc, and again, there's a lot of noise on a year-by-year basis, but we're looking on a longer arc here. If we're looking at how the composition of quarterback play has changed over the last 10 years, I'm not sure that it's gotten better. We had a real down period for NFL drafts from about, 2013 through, you could say 2015, 2016, depending upon how you think about Wentz and Goff and Dak and those guys. So there's a little bit of a downward trajectory there with talent not coming in. But if you want to look at a simple measure, and I think this is like something we have to think about it in the back of our heads, right? Is that like the NFL, it's not just, you can't just say it's plug and play, the players don't matter. Again, 2017, when we had a big decline in scoring before, that was almost directly attributable, I think, or mostly attributable to the fact that Aaron Rodgers got injured. A bunch of guys weren't playing well. Peyton Manning had left, and the top quarterbacks in the league, like Jared Goff, for instance, was leading the NFL in 2017 in net adjusted yards per attempt. This wasn't a great season for a lot of guys that year. And if we look at quarterback play over, again, guys who have either retired or like fallen off a cliff or didn't play last season, at least, for NFL quarterbacks, if we go back to my my QB GOAT series, just look at the names we're talking about. So, I had Peyton Manning at number 1. I know he and Brady were kind of 1A, 1B. But anyway, so we have 1 and 2, right? Those guys are both gone over the course of the last 10 years. I mean, Peyton kind of cliff dived in 2015, so it's been a while for him. But still, 1 and 2 gone. 3 is an older quarterback. 5, according to these numbers, at least for value add, Drew Brees. So he's been gone now for a few years. Number 7 is Aaron Rodgers. So we're talking about 3 out of the top 5 of all time. 3 out of the top 5, 4 out of the top 7. At least Rodgers not playing last year. And even if he does play, I mean, he's getting kind of old, right? That are not there. I mean, Mahomes is in here. Mahomes will eventually ascend probably to be at least in the top 5, if not at number 1 by the end. So Mahomes is already in there with his career. If you go a bit further down, we have Phillip Rivers at 15th. We have Matt Ryan at 26th. We have Ben Roethlisberger at 29, and we have Russell Wilson at 30. Tony Romo at 32. Romo's been out for a while. I guess 2015 was the last big year. The last year, actually got injured in 2015. So 2014 was probably the last big year he had. But anyway, we still are talking about, at least in the top 38 different quarterbacks in the top 30 who have really been put out of commission within the last 10 years, most of them within the last few years. When we're talking about Brady, Ryan, Rodgers not playing last year and kind of falling off a cliff. Roethlisberger, Rivers, all these guys being gone. I mean, that makes a big difference. I know that there's been excitement around a lot of different names that we've been talking about recently, but I don't think those names really are the boom of quarterback talent that make up for the loss of these Hall of Famers that have just been dropping off. This has kind of been the best period from, roughly 2000 to 2020 in quarterback play in NFL history across the board. So I think that's part of it that we have to think about it as part of this decline. But what do they point to? What do we point to with any sort of degree of certainty? So Opta Analyst talks about third and longer shot than it used to be. So a little play on words there. So third down conversion rates dating back to 1991 peaked in 2020 at 41.6%, and it's fallen to 38.8%. That's the same number that it was in 1993 when scoring was at its lowest mark since the 1970s. Now, where there's a lot more plays are happening now, offenses are running faster, so they're scoring more, even on similar conversion rates and similar efficiency. So there's a little bit going off there by those numbers. But it also says fourth down conversion rates has dropped in the same period. Okay, so a couple of different things here. I ran my numbers on third down rates. And yeah, third down conversion rates are down, but there's also another number that I calculate, which is like your expected conversion rate. Your ability to convert a 3rd and 1 is a lot different than your ability to convert a 3rd and 5, let alone a 3rd and 10. So we're looking at pure conversion rates. What are we looking at here? It's definitely true that conversion rates has fallen. My numbers are roughly aligned with what they have, which makes sense. Hopefully we're pulling from the same data. Now, the expected conversion rates have also fallen, which means that third downs have been getting more difficult because of less success on first and second down. Third downs have also become more numerous over the course of the last couple of years because of fewer first downs being converted on first and second down. So there's a lot of stuff in here about third down. And in fourth down conversion rates have gone down slowly, but That's completely offset by the fact that longer fourth downs are being attempted. So if you actually look on an EPA, expected points added per fourth down attempt, it's gone up both of the last 2 years. So conversion rate is really a poor metric for looking at how teams are doing. Teams are doing better than ever as far as actually adding value on fourth downs, because they're attempting more. They're making more of these calculated bets that are skewed in their favor. So just the fact they're not like more effective necessarily at converting fourth downs. But it's not an apples to apples comparison. If there's more 4th and 3s, 4th and 4s, 4th and 2s thrown into the mix, as opposed to a bunch of 4th and 1s, then yeah, your conversion rate can go down while you're still adding value here. But I think it's better just to kind of look at everything together. So when I looked at by down, how many expected points added per play, and then overall by season on different downs, you start to get a better idea of what's really driving things. And just as a, this is something that probably everyone knows intuitively, but just to make it explicit here, there are more first downs in the NFL than there are second downs, than there are third downs. Every drive starts with a first down. Some drives, most drives have a second down because you don't convert on first down or get intercepted or turn the ball over on first down. And then fewer drives have third downs, because you don't necessarily get the third down. Again, you might have a turnover or even more likely a conversion before you get the third down. So even if your like per play amount is going down on third down nearly as much as it's going down, the efficiency is going down on first and second down. And it is roughly. The total impact is actually much higher from first and second down. If we're looking at the total amount of expected points differential between first downs in 2020 versus first downs this year, we're talking about nearly 850-ish sort of like expected points differential in those seasons. On second down, it's also declined a ton. It's declined roughly 750. Third down in total, again, because there are fewer third downs that are happening, it's more in the neighborhood of 400. So these others are, roughly 2 times as important what's been going on first and second down versus what's going on third down. So conversion rates, but you also have to think about like what's the denominator with these plays. So I think third downs are really interesting to look at for a single game. Whether you convert third downs or not could be really, really interesting to look at how much of it drives results, because it's a huge driver of results for a single game. It's a huge driver of results sometimes for a player. There's entire seasons like Carson Wentz's 2017, which have been driven by outlier results on third down. But once you start to go every game for an entire season, every player for an entire season, and roll it all up, these differences that we're seeing are probably highly, highly correlated with overall success or failure. So the numbers, the lack of success on third down for teams recently in recent years versus what we saw in 2020, it's kind of mimicked with the lack of success in a lot of different areas. And third downs in total, now they have a higher variance in single games again, so they drive a lot of results in single games, but in total, the effect size is not as big as it is on first and second down. So I wouldn't focus that as much. They have a whole section on that. I think they're a little bit off to focus so much on that. What I did find really interesting, well, here's another thing that they're talking about. Explosive plays, getting explosive plays down. There's definitely something to that. I'm not going to deny that there's something to that. Yet I have trouble really pinning down exactly what it is, because people love to talk about strategy. The film bros, the film hipsters, the former players, the guys on NFL Live, when they get out there, their little markers and talk on the screen, and Orlovsky's dancing around with his sneakers, his high tops on, his suit high top combination. They love to talk about what's going on coverage wise, because that's what they know. That's what's interesting. That's what gets fans engaged. But how much does it actually matter? I mean, number one, we can't get a full accounting of how coverages are changing just by these different classifications that they have. So they have middle of the field closed, middle of the field open, Well, actually, what are they calling CO here? I guess they're just calling that coverage open. Oh, cover zero? Yeah, cover zero. That's what it is. So they have cover zero because it's a small amount. That's a zero, not an O. That's why I got confused. Okay, so cover zero versus middle of the field closed and middle of the field open. So the big thing everyone's been talking about is okay, now we got middle of the field open. In other words, two safety type of defenses, which is or are bringing down the numbers. Yet, if you look at 2020 versus 2021, if you look at the numbers here, cover zero is down from 2.8% of plays to 2%. Okay, it's down. Middle of the field closed is up a couple of percent, and middle of the field open is down a few percent. Um, So it's interesting how we're looking at some of this. In the middle of the field open coverages has the lowest explosive rate and the lowest yard per play. So I don't know. A lot of these numbers, it's like a 1 or 2% difference between these coverages being used. Now, I know these are very simplified sort of areas, but I also think this is an area that gets focused on a ton, which may not be the biggest area that you should focus on. They have zone and man coverage. And again, I just don't know if it's really that big of a difference. The differentials there. The numbers are always higher for explosive play rate when it comes to man coverage, and there's less usage with man coverage. But then on a yards per play basis, it's lower. So it's going to be a little bit situational there. But I think it's interesting. I really think the main takeaway, and something I wouldn't have necessarily thought on this level, because I guess I hadn't looked at this specifically before, from this article was the pandemic season being an outlier with NFL scoring. And what's really interesting is they plot home versus away scoring averages. Maybe it's a little bit, you have to wonder a little bit, but the fact that 2019, they're roughly equal between home and away. But in 2020, they're also roughly equal between home and away. And then we've seen a big differential again with the home team scoring more than the away teams. That's interesting. That's obviously going to give you a bit of a boost. The home scoring averages have gone down, but not necessarily way out of line from what we've seen in the past. And the away team scoring averages have gone way down, which more mimics what we've seen in the past. So again, it points to this 2020 season as being kind of an outlier. Why would away scoring be so much of an outlier? Well, what are the differences here? What are the differences that would only affect the away team versus the home team? Well, crowd noise would be one thing. Travel, lack of distractions when it comes to travel, and maybe being more prepared, more rested, things like that before going out and traveling. Referees being less influenced by the crowds and being on the road is a possibility. So all those things are a possibility for what may have happened, and it's not necessarily going to be replicated going forward. It is interesting, though, that there wasn't much of a differential in 2019 either, when I think people were already declaring home field advantage was dead, and now it's widened out a little bit more to what we have seen in the past. But I still think the biggest difference when we're talking about this is going to go back to quarterback scoring. And the quarterback, the pot of different quarterbacks that we have here. Let's look at the 2020 season and the quarterbacks who had the highest efficiency level for guys who had at least 400 dropbacks during the season. I think I have the playoffs in here too, so it's a little bit off, but you can look at this here. So number one was Aaron Rodgers. Of course, he didn't play last year and he kind of fell off a little bit the year before. Number two, Ryan Tannehill. Tannehill's really, really fallen off as part of that. The defenses have figured out what he's doing. I don't know. He didn't really play a whole lot, though, either. And he's had a really, really difficult circumstances in terms of his offensive line and this and that. Patrick Mahomes is next. So Patrick Mahomes still around, still thriving, although not quite as well last year. Josh Allen still around, still thriving. Tom Brady gone is number 5. Number 6, Deshaun Watson. I mean, for all intents and purposes, gone. Right? He's really been not good recently there. Number 7, Phillip Rivers. He's gone. Number 8, Baker Mayfield, who made a little bit of a comeback last year. It's pretty good. And then Cousins, Lamar Jackson, Drew Brees. Still, even Drew Brees, you might have thought that he had fallen off a cliff in 2020. He was still kicking. He's still kicking at that point. Russell Wilson at 13th. So you have guys like that. Or still around. Matt Ryan, not great, but at least giving you that average quarterback play. So was Ben Roethlisberger that season. So all these guys are gone. I still think that's a much bigger factor than what you're talking about. And you have a lot of guys like the Jared Goffs of the world. Even the Matthew Stafford, whose reputation has been enhanced greatly recently. Those guys have started to move up a bit. Kirk Cousins have moved up quite a bit as a lot of these other names have fallen out. And I think that more than anything probably gives the appearance of the NFL moving so much. So we'll see. We're going to get more and more data this year. We're going to get more and more quarterbacks who are growing forward from the last 2 quarterback classes where a lot of guys were drafted. I think it's interesting. I just think, don't make too much hay of some of the differences that we've seen there. All right. So the next article that I'll just briefly talk about an article for The Athletic about, has the NFL wide receiver market reached a breaking point? How much is too much? This is an article by Randy Mueller, I want to say, former GM who is now does a podcast with Mike Sando over at The Athletic. My only critique on here is I do think there's some interesting discussions about team building. I think teams have become more willing because of liquidity in the receiver market, that they moved around a lot more. That was the one position I pointed to is via trades. You could really get your hands on now where you couldn't in the past as far as a player in his prime, an elite player in his prime. So that has raised the market values. But I also think when we're talking about some of these numbers, like they're saying the A.J. Brown contract is 12.5% of the cap. All these other guys are making such huge percentages of the cap. A lot of these receiver contracts, and I talked about this last week, are fake, right? Like they're not going to make it to the end of them. They're going to be restructured. There's going to be a lot of dead money on the end, as opposed to someone like Penny Sewell's contract, which is probably going to be played out and extended even further in most circumstances. So I think that's a little bit of a mistake when we're talking about what's going on here, is to take these contracts at face value. A lot of them that are reporting at 30 million are really in reality are more like 25 million type of contracts, which is still expensive. Contracts are still going up, but I think that's being lost a little bit when we're looking at these contracts and we're saying, oh, guys are going to make 30 million a year, 35 million a year. But I do think it complicates the negotiations that teams like the 49ers and especially the Vikings have to do when they say, hey, we really want a real contract for Justin Jefferson, not one of these fake deals like Tyreek Hill or Devontae Adams got, where they're never going to see the end of the contracts. We want a real contract for him. How do we hit those numbers that they're going to look at and be able to afford this for a player we do want to keep for maybe another deal after this one, and not end up, cutting a few years into the contract? It does become interesting, but, that's the only thing that I would warn when we're talking about receivers is make sure we differentiate between real and fake contracts here. And now the last one that I want to talk about before going into the questions is Mike Sando again. So he's getting some love here. Article says, why drafting first round quarterback is worse than a coin flip unless you're the Bears. So there's pretty, elementary, if you want to call them analytics, it's more of just looking at some numbers on how often quarterbacks re-sign based upon whether they're the first, second, third, or fourth quarterback taken in the draft, and then what draft position they have. What they've ended up finding on an, albeit a very limited sample here, is that you look at extension rate. So that's the number that's being focused on here. So I'll talk about using that as your metric in a second. So the first round quarterback extension rate from 1993 to 2022 for second contracts with the team who drafted the quarterback. So the first quarterback drafted is extended about 57% of the time. So if you want to make it easy, say 60% of the time. The second quarterback drafted 35% of the time. So that's a major drop, right? The third quarterback, 31% of the time. The fourth quarterback, 14% of the time, only 1 out of 7. The fifth quarterback, a third of the time, 1 out of 3. None. There haven't been 6 quarterbacks drafted, I guess, who came up as part of this. They're not being used in the sample. And then in total, 40% of the quarterbacks are extended. So much, much more often you're getting an extension. Now, you have to wonder, like, is an extension what we're going for when we're drafting a quarterback? I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, looking at the exact names, and this is the data reflects 77 quarterbacks selected in the first round from 1993 through 2022. So Kenny Pickett's being included here because he's been sent packing. So it excludes Jordan Love, Tua Tagovailoa, and Trevor Lawrence because they haven't yet extended yet. First quarterback selected, 57% rate. Now, if you move that to first quarterback overall selected, it goes up to 67%. So a really, really high number here. And the quarterbacks who fall into this: Burrow, Kyler Murray, Jared Goff, Andrew Luck, Cam Newton, Matthew Stafford, Alex Smith, Eli Manning, Carson Palmer, Mike Vick, Peyton Manning, Drew Bledsoe. So those guys are all re-signed number one overall quarterbacks. The guys who are not re-signed with their existing teams: Baker Mayfield, Jameis Winston, Sam Bradford, Jamarcus Russell, David Carr, Tim Couch. What's interesting about this list is even the guys who were not re-signed, who went number one overall. I mean, Baker Mayfield has now been extended by the Bucks. Jameis Winston, I mean, he's hung around for a while at least, so that's somewhat interesting. Sam Bradford was traded for a number one pick for another team, right? The Eagles had him and then traded him for a number one pick to the Vikings, so he retained quite a bit of value. So you're really only talking about David Carr, Tim Couch, and Jamarcus Russell as retaining no value. Russell in particular, really no value. And some of these other guys that they're pointing to who were re-signed, who were the first quarterbacks taken in their draft, but not the first overall, include Blake Bortles, Matt Ryan, who I believe were both number 3 overall picks. Who else they have here? Chad Pennington, who was a little bit later in the round. Steve McNair. I think McNair was in the top 5, right? Was another guy who was re-signed. And then a lot of these other ones who were the first quarterback taken who weren't re-signed, again, were quarterbacks who were taken quite a bit later. Kenny Pickett, E.J. Manuel. Vince Young wasn't quite a bit later, but he was a little bit later. Jim Druckenmiller, Heath Schuler. So it starts to really point to the fact that the first quarterback taken has such a big difference in his success rate versus others. Now, I think that is true if your metric is going to be being re-signed, but there are some factors that end up being confounding variables here and why that ends up happening. I mean, the more you invest in someone, the more you're willing to re-sign them, things like that. A quarterback who's taken later isn't going to have the same amount of rope that a quarterback who's taken earlier is going to have for being re-signed, things like that. I think you are getting a more talented quarterback. But the reality is when you're drafting these guys in the first round, early in the first round, which I recommend, and this again points to the fact that you are getting higher success rate for that. I mean, what you're really going for is a high-end outcome, not just being re-signed. And the numbers below, there's also included in this numbers where they look at their approximate value, which is a metric that comes from Pro Football Reference. And don't worry about exactly what it means. It's not the best metric in terms of figuring out value, but it is going to look at the quarterback's efficiency and volume and all those sorts of things. Who are the highest guys that they've had in seasons 3 through 6? Well, the average for those guys: Josh Allen is number 1, Patrick Mahomes is number 2, Phillip Rivers is number 3. So the top 3 guys there were not the first quarterback selected overall in those classes. Patrick Mahomes was the second after Mitch Trubisky. Josh Allen was the third after Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold. And then a few spots went by before we got to Josh Allen. Phillip Rivers was the second. He was in the same class as Eli Manning. That famous trade between the Chargers and the Giants, flipping those guys back and forth. I think Rivers went third, I want to say, to the Giants before the trade happened. Then we get to Peyton Manning. Then we get to Dante Culpepper, who was the 4th quarterback taken in his class. Then we get to Matt Ryan, who was the first quarterback taken in his class, but was 3rd overall. And then we start seeing Cam Newton, Lamar Jackson, but Matthew Stafford, Donovan McNabb. But what I want to point out here is, yeah, some of these guys are the first taken overall, but this is really the number that we're interested in. Not this exact number, but something approximating this sort of number. Someone who's saying peak years 3 through 6 are pretty peak type of years. Most quarterbacks, if you're not good by your third year, forget about it. That 3 through 6 year time frame is a pretty good approximation for your early peak as a quarterback. It's really getting those high end outcomes that we're interested in. And that's why people will argue against taking a quarterback who's not a slam dunk Caleb Williams first overall type of guy in people's minds, because they say, look at the success rate. Again, their prospect evaluations are way too focused on success rate, and in this article using extensions as a proxy for that, than they are on just value added. That's why the positional value gets downweighted in a lot of the analysis from different draft gurus and draft analysts, is that it's the focus on success rate, the focus on hit rate versus value added. So, but if anything, I think once you get into the value added numbers, it flips the whole schema around on you, and it says you should just be taking a lot of these guys earlier, because you can maybe not get a high success rate with these guys being re-signed, but you can get big numbers as far as the overall value when you are successful. You have to be willing to take those shots, take them often, and not being scared in doing so. I mean, some of these guys who are re-signed with the same team, where there's Jared Goff, he's down in the teens here. Michael Vick, he's down at 17th overall for how much value he was adding. These guys are there's some guys that are pretty low. Carson Palmer is down at 22nd on here, who were actually re-signed. Blake Bortles, he was re-signed as the first quarterback taken, but he's very low value. Alex Smith was really bad the first 3, if not 4 years of his career, but he got an extension. So he falls into the category of guys who got re-signed. So there's a lot of guys on there who maybe don't belong, who end up getting that second contract, who end up being a success by some metrics, where I would really focus on hitting that elite sort of quarterback number and then continuing to move on and reinvest at the position. So interesting article, good data in here. I would maybe frame it a little bit differently and focus more on the overall value and the elite quarterback hit rates as being something to really focus on. And then it kind of goes to the whole thing of using analytics and using numbers is, are you trying to find a number that backs up a take? Or are you trying to find the most representative, most kind of truthful, insightful number, and then target that for how you're going to do your analysis? Both the data is given here. You can kind of go two different ways depending upon how you look at it. I would look at it more as it's proving that even if it's not the number one quarterback overall, take those shots, especially when they're less expensive, a lot less expensive in draft capital value, if you're looking like a Jimmy Johnson chart, to use later picks, and also less expensive on an actual capital value where, the 8th pick overall is making half amount the money that the number one overall pick is making in terms of the cap. All right. That's all I got for the articles of the week. Let's go to the questions from the website first, and then I'll get to some of them that are here on the stream. All right, let's bring up the comments from this week. Hey, Kevin, I upgraded sub to founder. Congratulations, my friend. Jamie, I assume is how you pronounce that. Do I get a chance to book a Zoom call with my favorite NFL data analyst? Well, number one, I'll assume that's me. I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'll bring that back. I'll be in contact. Broad question actually, let me go down to the first question here from Samuel, another founding member, the elite class here. His question is, what do you think the best metric is to compare contracts across players? Is there a way, and then second part to this, is there a way for teams to use preference for average value over guarantee reporting as an agents prioritize these to gain a small advantage in negotiations? Okay, let's go to the first thing first. So the first thing, and I went back to find this, and I haven't done it myself, but I think this is a good analysis here, where there was analysis by Arjun Menon and Brad Spielberger over at PFF, where they introduced something called expected contract value. And I think they do a pretty good job here. Unfortunately for them, they have JC Jackson as their poster boy. on here, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I don't want to get into the exact details on the methodology because it's a little bit confusing, but it intuitively makes sense. What they're doing is they're saying, let's look at the contract. Let's look at the guarantees that are part of it. Let's look at the position. Let's look at, a whole bunch of different dynamics here. Let's try to estimate how much of this contract they actually play out. There can be some difficulties because there can be restructures. There can be guys who stay on a contract but are forced to downgrade, all those sorts of things. Those are kind of like new contracts, though. So anyway, I won't get into all the potential downsides here, but they're going to say how likely it is this person plays out this contract. What would the values be that you would earn over those years? Let's count all guaranteed money up front as being like 100% earned, or they're going to be earned. And then we have a expected number of years, and then we also have an expected value, and then we divide the expected total value that's going to be paid divided by the expected number of total years, which can be a fraction because, again, there are fractional years that are going to happen here. And then we'll come up with an average value per year type of number. I think it's a pretty good methodology for how you would do it. Unfortunately, like I said, for J.C. Jackson, it shows a 96.5% chance that he would play through the third year of this contract. And guess what? He didn't make it through 3 years. He only played 1 year. With the Chargers, I guess technically he was still traded on the same contract to the Patriots, and then it was terminated after that. But the Patriots only paid like $1.5 million, and the Chargers paid him $38 million for 7 games. So it was a disaster outcome, and unfortunate that he's put on here. So a little bit off, but again, hey, it's just showing a 5%, not 5%, showing a 3.5% chance that he won't play out the third year. So it happens. They do make some good points here though about the number of players who play out these contracts that are 5-year contracts. Only 10% finish off the deal when they have a 5-year contract. So those 5-year contracts, again, it goes back to the wide receiver contracts I was talking about earlier, and the fake numbers at the end of these contracts. You got to really discount those heavily. They have Emmanuel Ogbah in here. I think this is an interesting one where it's 99.9% for 1 year, drops down to 90% likelihood of playing out 2 years, and then 46%. He was dropped after his third year, I think. So 1, 2, no, actually, it was after his second year. So he didn't make it through his third year. So that's an interesting one there. Chris Godwin, about a 60% chance of making it through 3 years. And then it says a 0% chance making it after that because it was only a 3-year extension that we're talking about. And so they have all these different numbers that they can compare. And again, when you take those sorts of numbers from their estimation, when J.C. Jackson was signed, you could say it was an expected APY, expected average value of, what does it have here? Does it have it here? Expected APY of $16.8 million a year. Now, it ended up being much, much worse than that because he didn't play out many years because they're expecting 3.4 years on average out of that, whereas $16 million for Ogbah and $20 million for Chris Godwin. So I think these are good. These are good numbers. They estimate the amount that would come back. So I think this is a reasonable way of doing it. Now, what are potential downsides? They also have a bunch of receivers they go through as far as what are potential downsides for this particular view? Well, I think there is a question when we're talking about values, and maybe this will also go into the second part of Samuel's question here about how they're reported and how they're talked about. There is a question of like, what do we care about? Do we care about money spent, which is basically what this is going to be looking at, divided by the number of years? Or do we care about when that money is spent and how it affects the cap? Because what a lot of teams are doing, and I think this is a way for teams to gain a small advantage in negotiations potentially also, is if you front load money, you're giving up more cash earlier, but you might be taking less of an actual cap hit. So it's like the equivalent amount of money that you could have been spending if you're able to amortize that money into future years. So rather than paying them a higher salary earlier. So that's something to think about. I think that's a negotiating point that probably helps with players, is to say, we're going to give you more cash up front. in terms of how they're reported, I don't really know. I mean, the reporting is all over the place for these guarantees. There's so many like de facto guarantees versus real guarantees, things like that. It gets very, very, very confusing. But I would say, yeah, when we're talking about how to compare contracts across players, I would be looking at something where you're trying to estimate how long they're going to be on that contract, and then figure out how much cash has been paid, and then figure out how much of an obligation it is on a season by season basis. If you want to look at total cap spending or just total dollar spending, that's how I would look at it. Favorite offseason hype, best shape of his life, contested catch videos, no look passes. I mean, best shape of the life is obviously the biggest one that we're going to end up hearing. Contested catch videos, I feel like we don't get those nearly as much as we used to, which was funny. Well, no, we got a lot of those with what's his name? George Pickens, which is funny. The contested catch videos are funny because arguably contested catches is the worst thing that you want to see. Like, you want to see guys open, right? Not having to make contested catches are probably preferable to having to make contested catches. So there might be a negative correlation there with guys who make great contested catches are not getting open enough. No look passes. I saw one the other day where Rodgers, it was like a kind of look pass. It doesn't do it for me. It might be probably just as effective, if not more effective than the true no look passes, but it didn't have the spark on social media that you would see. Which offseason story is most overlooked? Pat's defense considering Belichick retirement, Baker Mayfield without Dave Canales, Cousins coming off of ACL injury. Well, I mean, the Pats are going to stink probably. So if you want to overlook that story, I'm fine with that. Baker Mayfield, no, I'm kind of like, coaches don't matter that much, guy. So I don't think it's going to be interesting, but it could be. I mean, I definitely see that guy's resume being thrown around all over the place, and the work that he did with Wilson and then Geno Smith and then and Baker Mayfield. So we'll see. Cousins coming off a Achilles injury. Now that one got hyped quite a bit with the Penix draft pick and what that could mean coming off of an Achilles injury. So I don't think so. Now, I talked about this briefly before about what teams I kind of think are potentially undervalued coming into this year. So I don't know. I'm still thinking about the Bengals and what could go on with them coming into this year, is at least being a team that's somewhat overlooked, not highly overlooked, but at least somewhat overlooked this season. Broad question for these topics. Will you be doing an improvement index update with the draft class factored in? Yeah, I did do that last season, so I probably should update it. Have you looked back to see how your modeling has performed in the past? Well, let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's look at the improvement index 2023 post draft. Maybe am I able to find that? Oh, here we go. So share this tab instead. Unfortunate. Got Aaron Rodgers on there after he fell apart here. So what do we have here? We had Jets. Oh, look at the Texans, number 2. Ding, ding, ding. Props to me. The Bears, number 3. That didn't look so great in the first half of the season, but came through. But then again, the Panthers, number 4. So that didn't look great overall. Browns definitely outperformed this year. Seahawks were about average. Who's down at the bottom? Who did well? Well, the Packers did really well. Of course, that's mostly because Love outperformed. The Bucks did really well. That's mostly because Baker Mayfield outperformed versus Tom Brady. But I think the fact that the Eagles had fallen and then the Rams to some degree were probably fairly accurate. It's tough to tell with Minnesota. I had them negatively. It's tough to tell there because of the Kirk Cousins injury, but they weren't winning games, at least beforehand. So, it's tough to say. For the accuracy there. Okay, let's go to some of the questions that we may have in the chat here before wrapping things up. Q&A. As we intersect analytical statistics and the pure enjoyment of football, particularly when seeking advantages for entertainment or gambling, where do you draw the plus EV within balancing the game? I guess for me, I typically just don't. I'm not trying to think too much about the entertainment side of things, and maybe you could say that comes through in my in my analysis, but I just can't do it. Some people may be able to work well on that. I can't really do it. What I thought was interesting, and this is something again that could end up backfiring if I want to really talk about it. But what I thought was interesting is looking at this. There's this passage again. I'm talking about. I'm doing this like classical philosophy stuff. There's part of Plato's Republic where it's kind of looking at the philosophers on one side. So let's I'll indulge myself and say I'm like more of the philosopher looking for the truth in the NFL versus the rhetoricians on the other side who are good at influencing and persuading people. That one can kind of work with the other to then influence the public to help get your message out there. And I thought, that's interesting. Maybe I shouldn't be taking dumps on people doing bad analysis and instead trying to pump up them to help, because they're the people who are good at the rhetoric side of things, or at least they focus on that side of things. And I can't focus as much on that when it comes to gambling. But then again, I'm not selling picks or doing things like that. I never want to get into that for those exact reasons. So it's not maybe as difficult to figure out on here. What's your take on ecological dynamics and constraints-led approach to coaching as an edge in player development? Could player development be the next place for teams to seek an edge? Yeah, probably. The problem, though, with the NFL is that careers are so short. Careers are so short in the NFL that when we're talking about player development, it really has to be at the level of positions that you think you could get to definitely a second contract, if not a third contract. So I think player development when it comes to quarterback, obviously, player development when it comes to offensive tackle or something like that, probably. Those are ones you can have for a while. But outside of that, I don't know. I think in a lot of ways, not that player development itself shouldn't be focused on more so, but that the more focus you do on the potential efficacy of player development, the more you might get fooled in players being like a block of clay that you can mold and then make bad decisions based upon that. I think that can end up happening. Unfortunately, it's just not the case of being able to develop these guys nearly as much in the NFL as some other sports, at least in my opinion. Not to belabor the Penix pick, but why is that getting more criticism than last year's Bijan Robinson pick? I can't be the only one who's confused on this. Yeah, I mean, that I'm definitely confused on it. But the reason is, again, like there's nothing worse than, I guess, having redundancy, potential redundancy in a lot of people's minds when it comes to team building. And I just don't see that as being the case. It's the reason why everyone and their mother had a offensive tackle going to the Titans, despite the fact they have so many needs, and perhaps they even reached on a particular tackle. Because it's like you're filling a need versus potentially having some redundancy elsewhere. But it comes up nowhere else. Like the worst thing is not having an elite quarterback. The second worst thing in a lot of people's minds, actually, maybe it's the first worst things in a lot of people's minds, is potentially having two elite quarterbacks. Like there's nothing worse than that in a lot of people's minds, investing in that sort of way. This goes to the Jalen Hurts pick. This goes to the Penix pick. But yet we've seen two elite quarterbacks on the same roster. It happens in college all the time. It happens in the pros also. Steve Young, Joe Montana, Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, maybe Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love. You have Mahomes coming in with not elite, but, Alex Smith was playing at a MVP adjacent-ish sort of level the year that Mahomes was a rookie, and he was there for a while. So it happens. Troy Aikman and Steve Walsh drafted in the same exact offseason. So like we've literally seen it happen, and we've seen teams being able to keep one of the quarterbacks, be successful, have one of the other quarterbacks walk away and still be successful. So I don't know why it's such a it's such a barrier for some people to say it's okay, especially if we're talking about for a season or two, more than just one season, to have some duplication that it won't end up working. Last thing here on the YouTube says plenty of excellent defensive picks passed up in 23 to take a running back, but taking a high value position is a questionable move. Yeah. I mean, you got me there. Again, going back to the Bijan Robinson pick versus Penix, I'm 100% with you on that one. All right, gonna wrap this up here. Hope people enjoyed this. Go ahead, subscribe, unexpectedpoints.substack.com. I'm gonna start turning some of this into articles in the coming weeks. Otherwise, I'll have a live stream of here at least once a week, and then the podcast out on that. And also try to throw in some interviews. I contacted some people about this week, but a lot of people on vacation and doing other stuff right now. I got a good luck reading philosophy. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be annoying about that going forward. So I apologize in advance for that. Otherwise, everyone have a great rest of the week and the weekend, and I'll be talking at you guys next week.